Okay, we are on 28 B2, Daf Chavchet Amud Bet. If you're following the art scroll, it's 28 B2. The Gemara says, in the Mishnah, we described the terrible events that happened to the Jewish people on the two sad days of the year, the two saddest days of the years maybe, Shiva Asar B'Tammuz and Tisha B'Av. And the Mishnah told us that there were 5 things that happened on the 17th of Tammuz. 5 things happened to our forefathers on that day. The luchot were broken. Ask the Gemara, how do we know that that's the case? That the luchot were broken? How do we know that the Mishnah, how did the Mishnah deduce that? The Tanya, the Braita tells us as follows. God gives the debrot, the luchot, on the 6th day of Sivan to the Jews. Rabbi Yossi says, B'shiv'a bo on the 7th day. Now we have to clarify. Even the opinion that says that they were given on the 6th day, okay? On the 6th day they were given, and on the 7th day Moshe went up to be able to receive them. The opinion that holds that they were given on the 7th day understands it was given on the 7th, and Moshe received it on the 7th. What that means is that there's no machloket, seemingly, that Moshe received the tablets on the 7th day. The only question is, when did God give it? We have a song in the Syrian culture, Shesh b'sivan bo natan haTorah leYisrael. Now, one could argue that Rabbi Yossi is just not Syrian, but the Syrians would not like to have anyone not be Syrian, especially if they're important people. So the Gemara's reconciliation allows even Rabbi Yossi to follow the song of Shesh b'sivan bo natan, because on that day God gave it, but the gift was not received, so to speak, until the 7th day. And the Gemara brings a pasuk, Vayikra Moshe b'yom hashvi'i, and he called to Moshe on the 7th day. Now, there's another interpretation to this pasuk that would be able to be kind of explain that it was not received necessarily on the 7th day, but the Gemara for this moment is working with that assumption, and as well is using that pasuk as a biblical asmachta, which means that you rely on a pasuk to communicate something, even if it's not necessarily the only interpretation that is possible for that pasuk. Uchtiv, and it says, Moshe came into the cloud, and he went up to the mountain. He was there for 40 days and 40 months and 40 nights. Answers the Gemara. Okay, so let's do a cheshbon now. Let's hit the calendar. If on the 7th day he received the tablets, so Esrim ve'arba de Sivan, there's 24 days left in Sivan. So if you count what's called Ad ve'ad bichlal, Ad ve'ad bichlal means if I say from the 1st of January until the 30th of January, do I mean 2nd to the 29th? Or do I mean 1st to the 30th inclusive? So Ad ve'ad bichlal means inclusive. So if you're counting inclusive, there are 30 days to Sivan in that year. So if he received it on the 7th, and we count the 7th, and we count the 30th, that's exactly 24 days in Sivan. Vishitzar de Tammuz, and another 16 in the following month, the month of Tammuz. 24 plus 16 is 40. Malulehu arba'im. So with that, you fulfill the 40 days that we said he was in the heavens, 40 days, 40 nights. Bishivsar, so what that means is that when Moshe broke the tablets, that was after that period was fulfilled until the 16th of Tammuz. So on the 17th of Tammuz, Nachit Ata, he came down from the mountain. Ata v'tavrinu laluchot, he came down and he broke the luchot. Uchtiv, and it says, Vayika asher karav el hamachane vayar et ha'egel vayashlech miyadav et haluchot v'yishbor otam tachat ha'har. It says, and when Moshe came close to the camp and he saw the egel, so he threw the tablets and they were destroyed. Now it's interesting. The Gemara says a list of things that happen, terrible things that happen on this day of Shvat Asar B'Tammuz. But those are things, and it says, includes the first one, that the nishtabru aluchot, the luchot were broken. It's just interesting that if we just reconciled. We just talked about the date, and the date of the destruction of the Luchot is the date of the Egel. How come the Mishnah didn't say, as one of the 5 things, the Egel? That's why it's a sad day, a day of destruction, a day of fasting, because that's the day that we worship the Egel. The day that he destroyed the Luchot, that he broke the Luchot, is the day of the Egel. And the answer is, it's hidden in the language of the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, 5 things, ir'u et avotenu, happened to our forefathers. The Egel didn't happen to our forefathers, it was perpetrated by our forefathers. So therefore, 5 things, ahlan wa sahlan, kitonet pasim. Therefore, the Gemara says that this indicates that they were 5. That one of the 5 things is that the Luchot was broken on that day. The Gemara continues now in the recitation of the list that was brought to us in the Mishnah. Batala Tamid, the Korban Tamid was undone. It was uprooted. The Gemara tells us that this is something that we've always learned. So we know that this is what happened. That's how we know it, because we learned it. Okay? What does it mean, Butala Tamid? The Tamid was nullified. Came a point where the city of Jerusalem was under siege by the Romans, and there was nothing that could come in or out of the city. You know, it's fascinating. In ancient times, you didn't really need to defeat a city in war to take it over. All you need to do was literally make a ring around the city. You don't allow any food to come in or out. And if there's not enough food in the city to be able to replenish itself, you just maintain the status quo until the people are too weak to fight, or just everybody dies. Siege warfare was one of the things that it was very, very effective back in the day. And the only way to beat the siege was to have the people from the city leave the city walls or confines and manage to break through your siege line and bring food back. Either way, in that story, the Jews made a deal with the Romans. They said, we will lower a basket of gold and silver from the temple, which was an absolute fortune, obviously. And when the basket comes down, you put the sheep back into the basket and we'll hoist it back over the wall, and then we'll bring it as a korban. So they were paying a fortune each day for the korban tamid. And then eventually the Romans, instead of sticking a sheep in it, they put a pig in the basket. The Jews pulled it over the wall and suddenly had no korban to be able to bring for the tamid. And that fell out on the 17th day of Tammuz.
So they would use the sheep as a korban even when they didn't have food?
Yeah, the sheep is not going to solve the problem. One sheep is not going to solve the problem for the whole city.
Right.
So they would use the sheep as a korban even when they didn't have food, correct. They had money and they couldn't even spend the money on anything. Okay? The Gemara continues. Hufke'ah ha'ir biyudzayin hava. The city was penetrated, was breached on the 17th day. Ve'aktiv, ask the Gemara, 1 second. You're telling me that that's the day that this happened and that's a tragedy that happened on the 17th day of Tammuz? Ve'aktiv, doesn't the Pasuk say, B'chodesh HaRevi'i, on the 4th month, B'tish'a lachodesh, ve'yechezak ha'ra'av ba'ir. On the 4th, in the 4th month, on the 9th day of the month, the hunger really became very, very strong. Uchtiv batre, and right after that it says, Vatibaka ha'ir, and the city was breached. So you see clearly, again, remember like we just said, sometimes what they would do is they would just wait until the people had become sufficiently weakened from the fasting that then they would just walk in and kill everybody because they didn't even have the strength to fight. Vatibaka ha'ir, and the city was breached. So you see that without any pause between, and on this day, the hunger reached epic proportions of starvation, and therefore, when it says, and the city was breached right after that, we'd assume it was on the 9th day, not on the 17th day. Gemara says, Amar Rava, Rava explains, Lo kasha. No, it's not a question. Kan barishona, one, the pasuk that you just quoted, the verse that you just quoted from the pasuk is a pasuk in Yirmiyahu. In Echa, Kan, that's the first Beit HaMikdash. Kan b'shiniyah. What we're talking about over here is the 17th day of Tammuz, and that's in the second temple. And obviously the pasuk which was written about the first temple, is not going to tell you when it happened in the second temple. The Tanya. In the first temple, the walls were breached on the 9th of Tammuz. B'shiniyah, in the second temple, b'shiva sarbo, on the 17th day of the month. The Gemara then continues. Saraf apostemos et Torah. Apostemos burned the Torah, burned the Sefer Torah. So what does that mean that this happened? How do we know that happened? Gemara answers, again, Gemara, that's what we learned. It was the tradition that we had, that the day that he burned it was on that day. Gemara continues, and what's the fifth and final? Was that they erected a idol in the Beit HaMikdash. Minalan, how do we know that? Dichtiv, because it says in the Pasuk, Ume'etu Sara Tamid, and from the time that the Tamid was taken away, Vilatet Shikut Shomem, and to place a something which is disgusting, Shomem, which is impossible, it doesn't speak, it's so to speak destroyed. So what is it referring to? An abomination that doesn't speak in the Beit HaMikdash. What does that mean? So we already know in Hallel we say, Oznaim lahem, ears they have, velo yishmau. Pe lahem, a mouth they have, velo yedaberu. So the mute abomination refers to avodah zarah, to an idol. The Gemara asks, what do you mean? He'emid tzelem means that they put one tzelem. V'chad hava, was there only one? V'aktiv, doesn't it say? V'al kenaf shikutzim mishomem, and on the wing, okay, or on something that is done with the wing, which means very high, on the highest shikutzim, abominations, mishomem, that were unable to speak. So you see, he uses the word shikutzim. Shikutzim is abominations, plural. That means that there was more than one tzelem. So how come we're talking about one tzelem? The Gemara says, no, amarava trehave. There were two idols that they put in the Beit HaMikdash, and that was done, ironically, not by non-Jews. That's done by Menashe. During the time when Menashe, the king of Israel, tried to pull the Jews all away from God and towards idol worship. V'nafal chad al chavre. And one of the idols fell down upon the other. Utvare leliadeh, and it broke off the idol's hand. And therefore, the second idol, the idol that had the hand broken, that was already not considered in the first pasuk because it was not complete. V'ishtakach da'aviktiv, and therefore they saw that it was written on that idol. Ant tzavit lacharuve beta yadach ashlimtle. You tried to destroy God's house by putting these abominations, these idols in the midst, and therefore you paid for it, so to speak, with your hand, that the hand of the second idol was broken off by this occurrence that one fell on the other. There's an interesting lesson as well that we learn from this. You see, the pasuk does not call the idol with the broken hand an idol. And the question is, why? Is it any less of an idol now that it doesn't have a hand? And the answer is, that's part of the source of the halakha, that when people they buy a house or whatever and it has a statue in it, they break a piece of the idol off. And once a piece is broken off, that it's no longer considered the idol that it once was. So you see, where do we learn that? Where's a place where we can see that? You can see that we learn that over here, that the idol that does not have a hand is now not considered in the pasuk. It says, and it calls it shikutz, an abomination, not shikutzim, which is multiple, because it loses its identity as an idol. In the case of Abraham, though, he destroys them completely. So we don't know that he would destroy only one limb. Okay? Okay. Let's continue. B'Tisha B'Av, on the 9th of Av, Nigzal Avotenu Shlo Yikansu La'aretz. The 9th of Av, there was a decree on the Jewish people that they should not enter into Eretz Israel. Minalan, how do we know that that's the case? That the decree against the Jewish people with the spies happened on Tisha B'Av. Dichtiv, because the pasuk says, Vayhi b'chodesh harishon, it was on the first month, b'shana hashenit, in the second year, be'echad lachodesh, on the first of the month, hukam mishkan. So what's chodesh harishon? In the language of the Torah, Nisan. So we say Tishrei is the beginning of the year when you count the year. Nisan is the beginning of the year when you count the months. So Chodesh Harishon is the first of Nisan. So on the first of Nisan, Hukama Mishkan was the day that they put up the temple, the Mishkan, the moving temple of the desert. The Amar Mar, and our teacher explained, Shana Rishona, there you go. Shana Rishona, now I don't like saying it because it's a restaurant. Shana Rishona asa Moshe et Mishkan. In the first year, Moshe made the Mishkan. Shiniyah hakim et Moshe et Mishkan. In the second year, Moshe put up the Mishkan, v'shalach et meraglim, and he sent the meraglim. Uchtiv, and it says in that second year, v'hi b'shana hashenit, and it was in the second year, b'chodesh hasheni, in the second month, b'esrim b'chodesh, on the 20th day of the month, na'aleh ha'anan me'al Mishkan ha'edut. The cloud ascended from on the Mishkan. So remember, second year, second month. Nisan, second month. Iyar is the second month. So 20th of Iyar, the cloud rose up from the Mishkan, and that's how they knew they had to travel. Uchtivin, it says, they went and they traveled 3 days. 3 days would bring us to what day? The 23rd of Iyar. Amar Rabbi Chana Bar Chanina said, Oto Hayom, on that day, Saru me'acharei Hashem. They turned away from Hashem. Uchtiv, and the pasuk says, V'ha'asafsuf asher bekirbo, and the multitude, which is the Erev Rav, that was amongst them, Hitavu ta'ava, they desired something, V'yashuvu, V'yibku gam b'nei Yisrael. And because all these other people were crying and they had reservations about the fact that they'd been given some of these mitzvot, so they got everyone else to cry as well. Uchtiv ad chodesh yamim, until they were there for 1 month. Dehavlu esrim v'tartin, excuse me. That brings us to the 22nd day of Sivan, because they were there in that state of mourning, of the sadness that was brought by the Erev Rav, for 1 month. 1 month from the 22nd of Iyar, 22nd, excuse me, because it's Ad V'Ad B'Chlal, remember, it's inclusive. So the 20th, 21st, 22nd, because it's including the 20th, okay? So 3 days would take you 20th, 21st, 22nd, not 21st, 22nd, 23rd. So 22nd of Iyar is the date that we said. Then it says a month they were in this sad state where they were mourning that they didn't have their idol worship and their averot available to them anymore. Tivan, it says, "V'tisager Miriam shivat yamim." Right after that point, it talks about Miriam, and it says that Miriam was held for 7 days because she had tzarat for speaking out against Moshe. So what are we up to? 7 days. Count the 7 days from till the 22nd. So 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28. 7 days, 7 full days after the 22nd. So 23 through 29. Okay? It's the 29th day of Sivan. Uchtiv, here, there's 7 full days.
We're in ER, we're not in Sivan.
No, but then they said it's a full month. After that, they stayed there for a full month, the Gemara added.
Month was from
ER.
Nisan to ER.
Yes, and then after that, it said, and they stayed there for 1 month, which takes us from ER to Sivan.
Second month.
Second month, where they were crying about the fact that they had now attained all these mitzvot that they couldn't.
So the first month was a travel month, and the second month was a sad month?
The second month was a sad month when they had this ta'ava, and they wanted what they want. They desired, and they asked Kadosh Baruch Hu for the fact that they didn't have meat. So God brought them the slav, right? So this whole period of when they had meat, because they traveled on that day, they're crying about the meat. They stay there. It says, Chodesh Yamim, you're going to stay here. 1 month of days. Until it's coming out of your nose, God says. So they have 1 full month. That takes us from the 22nd of Iyar to the 22nd of Sivan. At that point, Miriam gets tzarat, and she then needs to count 7 full days from after she gets the tzarat. So she gets the tzarat on the 22nd. She counts from the 23rd until the 29th. So we're at the 29th day of Sivan. And on that day it says, Uktiv shlach lecha anashim, send spies, V'tanya be-29 b'Sivan shalach Moshe meraglim. V'chtiv v'yeshuv mituratz b'ketz 40 yom. So the pasuk actually says, on the 29th day of Sivan, Moshe sends the spies. So the pasuk actually corroborates exactly the cheshbon that we've had getting to this point. How long do they go into the land to search out to see if it's a good land or not? 40 days. Count 40 days. It brings you from the 29th of Sivan, okay, all the way to the date that we're looking for. Hani arba'im yom nachi chadavu. 1 second. There's only 39 days from Sivan, the 29th of Sivan, till the 8th of Av.
Excuse me.
Right? Until they return. Right? Because we're missing one since the full month. The full month of Sivan, Nisan, Iyar, Sivan, Tammuz, the Gemara, if you look over there, you'll see that Tammuz is missing. It's chaser, right? The Gemara answers because it's not full. It's not 30 days, 29. The Gemara answers, Amar Abaye, Tammuz dahi shata malyue malya. On that day, specifically in that year, the Tammuz had an extra day because the Beit Din added an extra day. How do we know that that's the case? Dichtiv kara alay moed lishbor bachurai. The pasuk says over there that he called a specific day to destroy, to crush the Am Yisrael as a punishment for their averot. So since the pasuk says there was a set time, an extra day, that refers to the set time of a Beit Din, when Beit Din sets the times by adding a day in the calendar. If it was a non-set time, then it would just have run at a regular 29, but because they set the time specifically, that means that we added one day, taking us to the 8th of Av when they return. The day that the Gezerah happens, the next morning it says they cry throughout the night. The next morning, Borei Olam says, you're crying, you don't want it? No problem. You're not having it. Uchtiv, and it says, Tisa kol ha'edah, v'itnu et kola v'yibku ha'am b'laylahu. Everyone, the whole people begin to cry. V'yibku ha'am, and the whole nation cries on that day. Now, to me, it's actually a wild thing. Could you imagine being in the camp on that night? Hearing millions of people crying. It must have been such a moving sight, to hear this. And Moshe and Aaron walking around, Yoshua Kalev begging the people, please, the land is beautiful. Hashem is blessing us with this. Don't do this. You don't know, the ramifications are going to be very bad. And they don't listen. And because of that, it's decreed that they want to enter into Eretz Israel. And as we know, what that meant is that they were going to die in the desert. And we'll read exactly about how that played out. So that happens on this day. So the first of the tragedies of Tisha B'Av is that the Jewish people, the Gezerah, comes that they're not going to enter the land of Israel. Yes?
This is on the second year? This occurred on the second year?
Second year, correct.
So then,
Second year of them being in the desert.
Into the second year of them being in the desert, yeah.
How long should it have taken? Let's say all
Weeks.
wow.
Weeks. You have to just think about it for 1 second.
No,
Geographically, where's Egypt?
Like literally right
Literally right there. So even if it's the furthest point in Egypt,
Yeah.
to travel across Egypt to get to the part of Israel that it borders on,
Yeah.
it's not that long, right? But they wandering, they're circling in the Sinai desert, even before that point, to be ready to enter into the land of Israel.
Do they know they're circling?
Yeah.
You would think a civilization would just make a civilization. Like, why pick up and keep going? In a circle.
They because all of their travels were based on the Ananei Kavod. When the Ananei Kavod would pick up off of the Mishkan, they would understand God is taking us to another place. The pillar of cloud or of fire would drive them to the next destination.
Okay.
So some places they were for a very short time. There's one stop in the Midbar, which is 19 years. So they're there for almost 20 years. You could have someone who's born who doesn't know any other spot other than that spot. Wow. 20 years go, they're like, we're leaving. They're like, what do you mean we're leaving? They're like, oh, you're a little too young. You don't remember. Well, you do this all the time. You have another place, they could sit there for 2 days. They pitch tent, they pitch the camp. By the time they pitch the camp, they build the Mishkan, time to go. So part of their punishment was this wandering in the desert, also without knowing necessarily exactly how things would play out. Yes.
If this is on the second year, and then the Gezerah comes on the second year, and they're punished for every day, then how come they weren't in the Midbar for 41 years?
It's a very good question, but not for now.
Okay.
But I'll give you the answer for that later. Why? How come they don't stay in the desert for 41 or even 41 or even 40, between 41 and 42? Because they don't have a second full year. That's part of it. Okay?
1 hour of one day and 1 hour of the last day, and in 5 days and 2 hours.
Okay.
Partial days count for days. So a partial year could count for a year.
Okay, the Gemara continues. Now the second bit in the Mishnah. Charab Beit HaRishonah. The first Beit HaMikdash was destroyed on Tisha B'Av. Because it says, U'b'chodesh HaChamishi, in the 5th month, B'shiv'a l'chodesh, in the 7th day, He shnat 19 shana l'melech Nebuchadnezzar melech Bavel, on the 19th year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Ba Nebuzaradan, Rav HaTabachim, Eved melech Bavel Yerushalayim, V'yisrof et Bet Hashem. Nebuzaradan was the king's executioner, okay? He comes, he drives this massive group of soldiers to Eretz Israel, and they burn the Beit HaMikdash to the ground. Uchtiv, u'b'chodesh ha'chamishi, in the 5th month, be'esor la'chodesh, on the 10th day, he shnat 19 shana l'melech Nebuchadnezzar melech Bavel, to the king, 19th year of his reign, of king over Babylonia. He stood before the king of Bavel in Yerushalayim. So that's that day, the 10th day of the month, describes the end of it. Now it's interesting just to look at the end of the pasuk. The end of the pasuk says, yeah, you see number pasuk number chaf on the left bottom side of the Pesukim on the page. Can you see it? You see on the bottom left hand, you'll see the letter Chaf, and it brings a pasuk. B'chodesh ha'chamishi b'sheva l'chodesh hi shnat 19. In the 5th month, on the 7th day, he arrives to Jerusalem. He burns the Beit HaMikdash. V'et Beit HaMelech, and the king's residence, the Jewish king's residence. V'et kol batei Yerushalayim, and all the homes of Jerusalem razed to the ground. V'et kol bait bet gadol saraf ba'esh. Every large home was destroyed in a fire. B'chodesh chamishi be'esor la'chodesh hi shnat 19. So on that day, he's standing here in Jerusalem. So the Gemara says, 1 second, I don't understand. Vitanya, the Breita says, Efshar lomar b'shiva. You can't say that it was destroyed on the 7th, because it says on the 10th. And you can't say on the 10th, because it says on the 7th. So these two verses contradict one another. How can it be that both these are true? On the 7th, they entered into Hashem's sanctuary, to the Kodesh. And they ate, they did all sorts of terrible things in the Beit HaMikdash to defile it. On the 7th, on the 8th, and the 9th. Samuch lechashecha, roughly before Shiki'ah, hitzitu bo et ha'ur, they lit it on fire. V'haya dolek v'yolech kol yom kulo, and it burned the entire day until of the 10th. Oy lanu ki pana hayom ki yinatutz la le'erev. The pasuk says, look, woe to us is that the day is now turned, it's kind of gone on, as the shadows of the evening are coming closer. So you see, again, this concept that the Beit HaMikdash was set on fire on the end of the 9th, and it burns throughout the 10th. That's why, even after the 9th of Av is over, there's still some of the laws of mourning that extend into the 10th, because the majority of the burning happens actually on the 10th of Av. This is what Rabbi Yochanan says. If I was there at that day, at that time, lo kavativ ela ba'asiri, I would have set the fast not on the 9th of Av, but on the 10th, because they only started burning it on the 9th in the evening, right? But the vast majority of the burning happens on the 10th. Because that's when it was burned. But since Rabbi Yochanan was not there at the time, and they decreed that the fast should be on the 9th day, and not on the 10th, so that's the minhag that carried on. That's the halakha that carried on. V'Rabbanan. And what about the Chachamim, who did it on the 9th? So, in other words, you're telling me that if you were there, you would have done something else. But how come the rabbis that were there at that time, why didn't they do what you just said? The Gemara says, "Itchalta de puranuta adifa," better to set the fast at the beginning of the punishment than to set it at the end, because the beginning is where everything came from. So the moment that they set fire to the Beit HaMikdash, that already was its end. The rest of it that took place was just the unfolding of the original tragedy. So the moment to commemorate is the lighting on fire of the Beit HaMikdash. The Gemara now continues and says the third of the 5 things. Ubashiniya, what about the second Beit HaMikdash? Also on the 9th of Av. Minalan, how do we know? The Tanya, we learned the Beit HaMikdash, liyom zakai v'choval liyom chayav. Just like we say that a person who has merit, we will bring him more merits. So if you started one tzedakah, Hashem is going to bring you another tzedakah to start. So too we would say that about calendar days. That if there's a day that has zechut on it, so we bring zechut to that day. V'choval liyom chayav. And bad things happen on bad days. Amiru. When the first Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, it was on the eve of Tisha B'Av, right before Shkiah, as we said. And it was on Saturday night. And it was also on the end of the Shvi'it year. In other words, the evening after Shvi'it, the year after Shvi'it, which is the 8th year. We discussed the Mishmarot, that there's different times where each mishmar, each grouping of Kohanim came to do their time of service in the Beit HaMikdash. And the Leviim was saying Shira at the time, and they were standing exactly where they're supposed to stand, on the special place where the Leviim stand. What song were they singing when this happened? And Hashem will bring to them back their own acts of aggression and violence. And in their evil, yetzmitem, he's going to cut them. They did not finish saying the verse, Hashem will cut them down. When the non-Jews that were surrounding the temple, besieging Jerusalem, managed to break through and conquer the Beit HaMikdash. And the same exact thing repeated itself, and the second temple was destroyed, that all of those elements were present in its second iteration of destruction. The Gemara then continues on the 4th calamity that happened. Nilkeda Betar. Betar was conquered. Now Betar was a massive city in the time of the Beit HaMikdash. It had, I think they said something like over 1.5 million residents that were there. It was a very well fortified city, and the story of how Betar fell was particularly tragic, and the slaughter that took place there was wholesale. They killed people to the degree that the Gemara talks about how the level of blood rising in the streets was flowing like a river through the streets from the people that were, could you imagine, a river of blood?
Didn't they also build fences with Jewish corpses?
That's in the aftermath of the story of Betar, the Harugei Betar. That's the decree of the 4th beracha. In the Birkat HaMazon, we say the bracha of Hatov VaMetiv, right? Hu hetiv umetiv uyetiv lanu, hugma lanu, hugom lenu, right? All that. What's this hu hetiv umetiv uyetiv? The Gemara says, when they finally allowed them to bury the corpses, there was a tremendous sense of closure that finally they were allowed to actually bury their dead. So they instituted the beracha of hu hetiv umetiv uyetiv on the Harugeh, the burial,
that the bodies didn't decay,
and the bodies didn't decay, and that they were able to bring them. They were able to bring them to Kivurat Yisrael as well. Okay, the Gemara brings. So the answer is Gemara. Gemara asks, "How did we know that?" The Gemara says, "Gemara, that was a tradition that we knew. That we knew that was the day that it was conquered." What was the story of the conquering of Betar? In the city, they had a tremendous tzaddik. His name was Rabbi Elazar. And in his merit, his koach, his power of tefillah was so strong that when he would focus on tefillah, he would become completely consumed with the prayer, and his prayers were defending the city. The Romans were trying to break into the city, but they had no way of conquering the city that was so strong with incredibly well fortified positions and very well skilled fighters. Anyway, there were some people in the city that were kind of double agents. They were like the type of Hellenized Jew. They were Sekrikun or whatever. Anyway, so they went to Bar Kokhba. They went to the man who was in charge of the city, the general, who was a very mighty man, and he was the nephew of this Rabbi Elazar. Anyway, they told him, go whisper, say that, we want you to come see that Rabbi Elazar is actually being seditious, and he's communicating with the enemy. They got someone to go up to him while he was praying and whisper in his ear. But because he was so engrossed in his prayer, Rabbi Elazar was completely unaware. He wasn't listening, wasn't paying attention. So he asked him, what did the guy tell you? And Rabbi Elazar, I don't know what you're talking about. But they'd seen that he was speaking to someone. So someone was speaking to him. So he didn't believe him. And out of anger, he kicked his uncle. But he was such a strong warrior that the kick actually killed Rabbi Elazar. And now their protection was gone. They let the Romans in the city. And the Romans conquered the city of Betar with untold death that happened there. The Gemara continues. That happened also on Tisha B'Av. The Gemara continues. Tanya, we learned. When Turnus Rufus plowed under the Beit HaMikdash, they decreed that Rabban Gamliel should be put to death. Turnus Rufus was the protagonist in many stories with Rabbi Akiva. He was the Roman protectorate of the city at the time, and he had many conversations that were recorded with Rabbi Akiva.
Circumcision.
Many different things, fascinating stories about their interactions, and as well other things that happened with Rabbi Akiva, Turnus Rufus, etc. Okay, so Turnus Rufus at the end winds up plowing over the city of Jerusalem. And there was a decree, there was a gzerah that Rabban Gamliel, who was the Nasi at the time, he was the leader of the Jewish people in terms of the fact that Rabban Gamliel was a direct descendant from King David. So he was the Nasi. Ba'oto Adon Echad ve'amad bet midrash. This official came and he's standing in the study hall. Ve'amar Ba'al hachotem mitbakesh. Ba'al hachotem mitbakesh. The guy with the big nose, we want him. We need that guy. Let the guy with the big nose come forward because they wanted to kill him. Why was he saying that? What was this big nose? Okay, and the Gemara says that was a way of this man, this Roman general, warning Rabban Gamliel about what was about to happen. Okay, so I always wondered, what is this indication of this big nose? Why is he telling Rabban Gamliel? Why is he saying the big nose is wanted, the big nose is wanted?
Talking about the Jew.
Well, again, but how is Rabban Gamliel meant to understand that was a reference specifically to him?
The highest. It's like
Erech Apayim doesn't mean...
If you had a big nose, you could have a long breath.
Potentially, but again, how would that specifically relate to Rabban Gamliel? Yeah?
he was like the head honcho. He's like,
Yeah, but you call the head honcho big nose?
I mean, it's a metaphor.
So one way to understand is a metaphor. I think that there's another answer here. Rabban Gamliel, as we said, descendant from King David. Who else is going to be a descendant of King David? Mashiach. It says about Mashiach that one of the things that makes Mashiach is v'haricho b'reach Hashem. He decides a court case. He doesn't need to listen to the details. He can smell who's correct. Why? The deeper sources explain, because there's only one sense that was not participating in the original sin of the Etz Hadat. The Pasuk says that the fruit looked beautiful, that means the eyes were involved. She listened to the voice of the snake, that means the ears were involved. She ate it, that means Taste was involved. She touched it. That's actually what caused the sin. That means the sense of touch was involved. The one sense that was not involved in the sin is smell. And therefore, smell retained its high spiritual level because there was no element of the sin that was done with it. So when Mashiach comes and in a perfect world, how does he be able to distinguish? It's Hashem. So you see that he's deciding things by. So a way to talk about a descendant of King David, Rabbi Gamliel was the person with the big nose, and that's how Rabbi Gamliel understood.
Yeah, but the Romans didn't know that.
The Romans were very, very well educated in Judaism. In fact, we have many recorded conversations between the Romans of the day. Remember, the Romans were very studious people. They, unlike other barbaric nations, they really valued knowledge. They valued wisdom. You had the sages, you had the Senate, etc., etc. In other places, it wasn't like that. So Greek and Rome at the time were big proponents of higher education, of learning, whereas everyone else up until that point were just barbarians. So the Romans prided themselves on wisdom, on philosophy, on etc. It didn't make them stop being animals. They were still incredibly brutal, but at the same point, they still knew a lot. In fact, in many of the conversations, in many of the conversations between Turnus Rufus and Rabbi Akiva, you see that he knows a lot about Judaism. Okay. In fact, as well, Rabbi Gamliel is a descendant of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, and Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi was also Roman. Lived in the Roman era. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi had a study session, chavrutas, with Antoninus, with the Roman emperor. In fact, they dug a tunnel from under Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi's house to Antoninus so they could study Torah in private.
But Antoninus had to kill his 2 guards every time.
And each time Antoninus had 2 guards stationed at the front of the tunnel, at the end of the tunnel. One on each end, I think. Mm-hmm. He would kill the guard on the way, that guarded the tunnel on the way out, and then he would kill the guard at the other end of the tunnel on the way back. And every time he went to study with Rabbi Yehuda, he would do this practice, so that no one would know that he was studying Torah with Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. They were very close.
You know, I thought it was fishy that this
Yeah, every time
Guys.
2 people die.
his guards keep killed.
Isn't that a Chilul Hashem?
This is Rome. Soldiers are dying. Everything was subterfuge and mutinies, and it was very, very regular. Also, a life of a soldier in Rome was worth nothing.
Wow.
Think about the gladiators. They killed soldiers. They killed these people for sport. Yeah. Okay.
They also nursed from their mothers.
That's how the relationship began. There was the parents, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi and Antoninus as babies, were friendly, and as well they were nursing from each other. Okay. Gemara continues. So now he's been warned by this Roman noble. Shamar Rabbi Gamliel Azal Tashaminayu. Rabbi Gamliel understood, and he went into hiding from them. Azal Gabe B'Tzinah. This Roman official then came to him quietly. Amar le, Imatzil nalach, maitit li la'amadati. If I save your life, will you get me into the world to come, to Gan Eden, in the afterlife? Amar lehen, he said, yes. Amar le ishtabali, swear to me. Ishtabali, he swore. Salik li'igra, he went up to the roof and he threw himself off the roof in order to be able to save Rabbi Gamliel. Ugmiri dechi gazre gezirta umit chad minayu mivat legazretayu. Because the Romans had a thing that if they passed the decree and then one of the officials, the nobleman amongst them, died before the decree was put out, they would annul the decree because they saw that as a bad sign, that this was not something they should do. So he took his own life, this Roman noble, in order that the decree against Rabban Gamliel would be rescinded, and Rabban Gamliel promised him a portion in Gan Eden. Yatzet Tabatko, a heavenly voice came out, V'amera, Adon Zem Muzman l'chayei olam haba. This Roman official is called to the world to come. Okay, let's pause here.